Every app that you use uses an API. Uber, Instagram, Facebook, all that sort of thing, they use APIs. But do you know how they work? In this video, I'm gonna explain how they work so that you can know how they work. So let's get right into it. So APIs aren't just for the backend devs. They are good for passing an interview. There's going to be an interview for those. You could build some cool projects, and it just overall helps if you understand them and you'll improve as a developer. So let's break down APIs. So what is an API? An API is a application programmable interface. You can search that up on Google. Okay, what does this mean in layman terms? Because that's what I'm about here. It basically is a middleman to the content that you need. What does this mean again? For example, if we have a weather application, okay, and we want to access some of the data that it has, this weather app, name it, weather. And behind here is data that you need, forecast data, from 1900s, all this data. And this weather app is surrounding it, and you over here want to access that database. This is where APIs come in. This is basically a good explanation that you can use for interviews. So through our API calls, and what are API calls? API calls are functions that you can call to get that data from the database. Okay, so let's recap this. Let's recap. I know we're already getting deep. So think of an API as like a server at a restaurant. Okay. You sit down as your personal application. You want to order, let's say, chicken fried steak. Well, the only way you can access a chicken fried steak is if you tell the server, aka the API, which chicken fried steak you want, the API call, the function. So you tell the API, the server, hey, I want a chicken fried steak. And so the server will run all the way to the kitchen, tell the cook, aka the database, to cook to get you that chicken fried steak, and then the server brings it back to you in the form on a plate. That's the form, aka JSON in programming, and gives it to you, which then you can do what you want with that chicken fried steak. Eat it, show it off, take pictures, photo or phone it first, that sort of thing. So let's run it back. An API will let you access data in some way, shape, or form, fashion. So you have three different types of APIs. You have REST API, GraphQL, and WebSockets. I haven't heard too much about that, but this is like, chat apps, uh, like stock prices, that sort of thing. But the main two are REST APIs, which are used. They're like JSON, so they use HTTP most of the time. So over the web, hypertext. We're not going to get too deep on this, but the REST APIs will give you that data in JSON. So REST is basically the format of the API. How are you going to get that data? What type of plate is that data going to come back on? What's the server like? Are they going to move fast? Are they going to move slow? Or what are they going to tell you if they don't have food ready? That sort of thing. That's like REST. So in GraphQL, that basically gives you more ways on getting that data. So if you want to, get your drink last, but you only want your drink in the appetizer, but you don't want to order, that's kind of like what GraphQL does. It'll let you access certain things on the database without having to go through the whole, step by step by step process and get all that. You know what I mean? Like if you don't want to get a full course meal and go through the server and the server has to do all that work, you could just say, "Hey, just bring me the dessert and the appetizer." And you can skip the middle, the lunch or whatever. But that's kind of like GraphQL. It's flexible, it's new, and that's an API, or you can use APIs with GraphQL. So, how do APIs work? There are basically 3 or 4 API calls that you can do. So you could do a get API, you could do a post, you could do a put, and I think you could do get, post, put. Correct me if I'm wrong, but those are the main 3: get, post, put. And so what you can do is get the data. Okay, that basically just grabs the data. You can put the data, aka update it, or you can post the data, aka create a new one. And so this will allow you to interact with the database. So if you want to get information, you'll do a get API call. And basically how this works is you put get and then you say chicken fried steak, but you also need to tell it what database to go to. So you say get at this database this information, and that'll pull that data and give to you. So that's kind of how APIs work. Now, there are some nuances. So, for example, the database actually needs to open up ports to access the data, and that's a whole rabbit hole down it in itself. So, if you want to access some data from, like, say, the weather, say there's a big database and there's weather, and then let's say on another thing, there's like sports. So if you want to access the weather, you'd probably have to go through port 200 or this port, and then you'll have to access, oh, I want sports now. So you'll have to access that. And so you can use that as the URL, says URI, to access that data. Okay. And certain groups have certain API calls that you can call. So this is just like an overall, I'm just giving you information so that you kind of know what APIs are, because a lot of this stuff you can read a full on document, and if you don't have this kind of layman term understanding, it's hard to understand. But after this video, you can do all the research you want, and I'm sure you'll find this out. So now that you know the basics of APIs and how they work, now let's go ahead and add another thing to this. So you also will have API keys. And you may be wondering, okay, what's an API key? Now, an API key is given to you to say, hey, you have access to this. Okay. So the weather, you can go and sign up on that weather page, or that software, say, hey, create me an account. This is my credentials. I'm going to go ahead and pay monthly, for these weather updates that I can call. And so then they will give you the API key, which then you can use this key, which your API calls. So you give this key to your server and say, hey, this is me. Give me my weather information. Okay. So that's kind of how it works. That's an API key. It gives you access to that database. It tells you who you are, what access do you have. Now, also, along with an API key, there is usually a JSON Web Token, or a JWT. This is usually like an extra authentication on top of it. So basically what happens is you'll use this API key that you have to say, hey, I need a server, or I need somebody to, I need an API. And you'll create this JSON Web Token, which then you can use to get the API calls over and over instead of using that API key. So this should be enough information to where you understand API keys and API calls and what is an API. And if you get asked in an interview, for example, what happens when you make an API request? You now know that, the whole situation. You could just go ahead and pull up the example of a server at a restaurant. And the server is kind of like the API calls that you're making back and forth. And you have the client, which is you. You have the server, which is the database, and you have the responses, which is the REST. Okay. And the client updates the UI and that sort of thing. And so this should give you a good basic understanding on what APIs are and how to use them. Some common use cases, excuse me, would be authentication. That JWT, you could use it, the API key, the API calls to get the JWT token to then, you know, update and get the credentials. You can use it for APIs. Some of the most popular APIs are Stripe, PayPal, Google, OpenAI, that ChatGTP you can do API calls with. You could do social media. They usually do APIs to get that information from the database, put on your phone, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, that sort of thing. And just to recap, APIs are how applications talk to each other, how database talks to the client. Um, Modern applications use REST APIs, and making API calls are very simple. It's just a HTTP request. Okay, it's web. And some of the errors that you might get are like 200 for success, 404 for not found, 400 or 500 for error. I'll put a link in the description for those two. You can look at that. Go ahead and put in the comments what's an API that you've used and how you used it, and if you've been asked this in the interview. Like, comment, subscribe for more information like this. Check out my website, way more information on this sort of thing regarding interviews, regarding applications, regarding leak coding, data structures, that sort of thing. So check out my channel, check out my website, and I will see y'all guys in the next video. Keep on learning, keep on grinding. All right, peace out.